Over the past couple of years, we have seen very strong investment into a green transition. For example, investment in China's auto industry grew by 22% over the past couple of months.
We're going to be talking about China's post-COVID recovery, opening borders, and what's happening in the road forward. So joining me here today on stage, I have Kevin Shi, Director of Macro Research at CCB International Holdings.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the inviting.
Thanks, Kevin. Maybe before we begin, do you want to give us a bit of background into your professional experience?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an economist, so covering China and global markets. So I previously did my study in Australia. So I stayed in Australia for almost like 16 years. I worked at Commonwealth Bank of Australia for the past 7 years. Lately, I moved to Hong Kong and now work for the China Construction Bank International Securities. Still an economist.
Thanks, Kevin. And so China stepped away from its zero COVID policy in late 2022 and started this year with a bit of a focus on reopening its economy and its borders. What are some of the key developments, economic, et cetera, that you've seen coming out of China in recent months?
Yeah, sure. So the January to February economic data really shows broad-based economic recovery. And, the COVID exit in China has been much faster than many other countries. And it took only 1 to 2 months for China to reach a peak infection, and then the COVID just faded. So, one of my favorite tracker to monitor the initial recovery of Chinese economy is the daily metro passenger traffic. So that indicator has recovered very quickly over the past couple of months. And now the number of daily passengers pretty much, reached the same level before the pandemic. So that's really not a surprise to see the official retail sales has rebounded sharply and reported the first positive growth after 3 months of contraction in Q4 last year. So we expect that the recovery in consumption will continue. But also, industrial production has also rebounded, but missed the expectation. So we think there's probably 3 factors waiting on factory operation. The COVID exit has led to a really sharp spike in infections, and also the Chinese New Year. First time people can actually took some time off and go back to their hometowns and celebrate with their families. So really, the absence of workers have contributed to the low utilization of their production capacity. And also the soft demand, foreign demand has also weighed on industrial production. So the Chinese exports has slumped in Q4 and still quite weak in the first couple of months this year. But we think recovery in industrial production should continue. And the third one would be investment. Investment growth also rebounded and beat expectation. And infrastructure and manufacturing investment growth remains very solid. But the big surprise was actually a sharp turnaround in property investment. The annual contracting pace in property investment has eased quite sharply from 10% to just 5.5% in the first 2 months. Really the Chinese government, Chinese regulators' efforts start to work and made a real difference, easing cash flows for property developers and also ensuring delivery of housing projects and stabilizing sentiment. And the COVID exit has also released pent-up demand for property. So, overall, I think the data was quite positive, and we continue to expect a recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. You started to talk about some of the new policies coming out of the Chinese government. Which maybe you can go a little bit deeper into which ones are helping to kind of propel the economy forward?
Yeah, I think one of the key, the most cited targets out of the 2 session meetings and 2023 government work report was a growth target of around 5% for 2023. was below market expectation. But I think this target was really consistent with the policy message at the Central Economic Worker Conference held last December. A target around 5% will really means the Chinese government is focused on delivering medium-term sustainable growth rather than strong near-term growth by overstimulating the economy. But having said that, the Chinese economy is still at the early days of recovery, still need policy support, and the governments have reiterated expansionary fiscal policy and easy monetary policy. So on the fiscal front, we see the 2023 Work Government Report said that they will increase the on-budget fiscal deficit from 2.8% to 3%, and also increase the local government special bond quota to 3.8 trillion RMB. So, we think these will deliver targeted support to help stabilize employment and also help the vulnerable part of the economy. The SMEs have been hit quite hard over the past 3 years, and also an increase in the local government special bonds will help support infrastructure investment, because the local government special bonds have become the primary funding source for public investment over the past couple of years. And also, of course, a monetary policy has been quite easy. So 2 weeks ago, the PBOC, which is the central bank for China, has delivered a 25 bp cut to the required reserve ratio. So that will release 500 billion RMB liquidity to support credit growth. And credit growth has really picked up over the first 2 months on the back of strong bank borrowing demand. The last bit I want to mention is the government measures to stimulate consumption. And the recent policy communication has reiterated the importance of consumption to the Chinese economy, really, because the past 3 years, consumption has suffered a big blow. But we don't think the central government will deliver checks or cash handouts to households, not like the Western governments. So one major reason is that China doesn't really have a well-defined national social safety network, social safety net system. So instead we think the local governments will deliver consumption vouchers and cash handouts and other sensitive to encourage local residents to purchase new energy vehicles or other consumer goods and services. So that's it.
Just to remind the audience, we are taking questions. So if at any point you have any questions for Kevin, then just put up your hand and we'll get a microphone over to you. You started to get into kind of the industrial growth, investment growth, infrastructure, and property earlier. Can we look a little bit at metals consumption within China? And, are these kind of factors the main drivers for consumption? And which metals are in top demand as well?
Sure, not an commodity expert, but of course I can talk about the trends in the Chinese economy, which will will shape the Chinese economy. Of course, the metal demand as well. I think in the near term, the continued recovery will drive the Chinese economy, but of course will drive them probably a recovery in Chinese metal demand. China is the largest commodity, is the largest consumer for many commodities. Just to mention a few, China represents about 55% of global copper demand, 70 to 80% of global iron ore demand, and 50% of nickel demand. So that's China is right now is far from a full recovery. Sequential growth in industrial production and the retail sales remains below pre-pandemic levels. So I think as long and of course the property sector only just start to stabilize. So I think there's still a lot of room for China to get on to the pre-pandemic speed. So that will help the demand, iron ore and others. But of course, in the medium term, there are a few structure factors driving Chinese economy and shape China's metal demand, the first thing I want to mention is housing construction is likely to continue to decline or slow. So, China's housing investment driven by urbanization and China's large population has really drive China's metal demand over the past decades. But now, things have changed. According to China's National Bureau of Statistics, China's urbanization rate is about 65 to 70% in 2022, which is only about 10 to 15% below rich countries. And also China in 2022 had reported the first population decline. So, and given China's one-child policy, in 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, the population decline is set to continue over decades to come. So overall, the urbanization will become less a demand driver for China's property. Instead, we think, upgrading and replacement will be the key driver for China's property demand from here. So the other thing is manufacturing upgrade, which we can also call it industrial upgrading. So that's really about boosting China's productivity. And the Chinese government alone is worried about China's future and how if China can sustain strong growth and over decades to come, if China can escape the so-called middle income trap. So middle income trap really describes an upper middle income country and failed to grow and failed to become a high income country. So according to World Bank, of over 100 middle income countries in 1960s, only 18 or 13 become high income countries in 1980s. So China right now is an upper income country, upper middle income country. So the task of escaping the middle income trap is quite challenging for the Chinese government. So that's part of the reason the China came up with Made in China 2025 quite a few years ago. And now, the intensifying, tensions between China and US just made things worse for China because the US now increased restrictions on China's access to technology. So, but, there's always risks and opportunities. In Chinese language, the English word crisis actually is composed of two Chinese letters. So the first one means risk, the second one means opportunity. So because of these restrictions and other issues, it really sort of create, a motivation or impetus for the Chinese government, also Chinese business, to work hard and trying to upgrade their capability and trying to move up the supply chains. And in recent years, we have seen very, very strong investment into digitalization, automation, and upgrading, and you name it. The investment has been pretty strong. So that will help China to boost productivity, to maintain competitiveness. The last structural trend I want to talk about is green transition. So in September 2022, the President Xi pledged China will peak carbon emission by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So, China really runs a very carbon intensive economy. And really because China's reliance on coal, 50% of carbon emission comes from the power supply and power generation sector. And another 30% comes from upstream industries and transport, for example, like a steel making industry. So, for China to move away from that highly carbon intensive economy, then it requires a lot of investment. And the PBOC governor, Yi Gang, once estimate China needs about 2 to 4 trillion RMB investment into green related industries every year by 2030. But we think that number actually is an estimate. China probably needs more. And over the past couple of years, we have seen very strong investment into green transition. For example, investment in China's auto industry grew by 22% over the past couple of months. Really, well above China's overall investment growth of just 5%. Really, the strong investment was driven by very fast and strong expansion of electric vehicles.
I'd like to move on to some of the other key topics that we wanted to cover today. First one, you've been talking about some of the growth drivers, and the electric vehicle economy in China is kind of one of the growing sectors, and it's been kind of there for a while, one of the first to really kind of prompt that. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of that, that industry on China's economy and growth?
Yeah, the rapid development of green-related industry really, have the potential for China's, industrial upgrading, but also offers potential to find a new growth driver. So, for example, we have mentioned the electric vehicles. The penetration of electric vehicles in China last year reached 30%, and we project that penetration rate will reach 35% this year. And globally, we see, European unions has announced to stop the sales of combustion vehicles by 2035. I think China, the deadline is 2040. So, I think the world is really adopting electric vehicles at a very fast speed, and led by China and Europe. So, China has already had a few global leaders business in the supply chain of electric vehicles, for example, like battery and car, whole car making. So I think, as long as China's electric vehicles can grow its market share in a global car markets, that could become a new growth driver for China going forward, especially, given the likely relatively decline of property sector. And our research also shows a different set of industries will benefit from the economy rotates away from property investment to green investment. So especially the equipment manufacturing, including general electrical manufacturing and special equipment manufacturing. So this kind of industries will benefit the most, but also non-ferrous products will also benefit. For example, lithium. And there will also be industry losers. We think the most possible loser will be non-metallic producers. For example, like cement, glasses. These materials are used a lot in housing constructions, and now the housing constructions is likely to stagnate or decline. So this industry will suffer the most, and also demand for steel products will also likely decline over time.
Okay. And my last question was, there's a lot of talk about the geopolitical situation, specifically with the shifting supply chains, specifically away from China, and that includes a lot of the metal supply chains. What is the perspective that you're hearing regarding the whole supply chain discourse?
Yeah, it's over the past few decades, globalization of supply chain organization is really focused on cost minimization. I think now the mindset has changed. I think it's not just about the China-U.S. tensions, but also the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Also, the pandemic has really disrupted supply chains, and the China-U.S. tensions will continue to persist, even intensify over decades to come. So that's why there's lots of discussions on supply chains moving away from China. But I think we need to look at why supply chains move away from China. So the supply chain shifting away from China to Southeast Asia was not something new. And if you look at the history, you look at other industries like textile, clothes making industries. So this industry is basically low-end and the labor-intensive industries move out of China since the global financial crisis, really because China couldn't compete with these countries in terms of their rising labor costs, tighter labor rights protections, and more stricter environmental and other regulation as well. So that's why, China has been basically this industry move out of China. But it doesn't mean, trades in China is sort of disadvantaged. China is actually a shift away from exporting consumer goods to America's advanced economy by exporting intermediate goods and capital goods to these emerging countries, because like Vietnam, they actually import a lot of China-made intermediate goods and machineries, and then they use that and take advantage of their cheap labor and make consumer goods and then export to the advanced economy. So there's like, this is big supply chain reorganization, but China can actually benefit as well. The other thing is China's stance on trade. It also matters. Against this rising deglobalization rhetoric, China actually has been promoting foreign trades and opening up. For example, China recently has signed the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, with ASEAN and other countries. So, and the opening up policy and also the RCEP will boost, the production trade investment within Asia Pacific. And China is looking to upgrade existing trade agreements with other countries, and they're looking to sign new trade agreements, for example, CPTPP. So, like, I think at the end of the day, the China probably will end up like a trade diversion, right? So China, right? ASEAN is already China's largest trading partner. China trade 50% of trade is done with its neighbors. So we expect, these sort of trade agreements, China's open policy will increase or deepen the trade and supply chain network between China and its neighbor countries. The other thing is, the supply chain diversification goes both ways, and China is also wants to diversify its technology supply chains and also its metal supply chains as well. For example, China trying to diversify its over-reliance on Australia for iron ore, but the US is trying to diversify its reliance on China for rare earth. So I think, at the end of the day, the focus on supply chain reorganization has shifted away from efficiency to resilience, from on time to in case. So, we're going to see lots of potentially we're going to see redundancy in the supply chain organization. But it doesn't mean, the relation between China and the economic relation between China and the US going to be fully decoupling. And these two countries will remain very interconnected for many years.
All right, great. We have time for one last question, if there is any from the audience. All right, in that case, thank you, Kevin, for joining me here today.
Thank you very much.